All right. Welcome back to another great episode of the Empire Builders. Then and now, we will be talking about Pearl Harbor, the catastrophic cost of strategic blindness. I am your host, Will Tiemann.
And I'm Mike Treniff.
All right. We'll begin on December 7th, 1941, 7:53 in the morning. A young radar operator named Joseph Lockhart is sitting at a mobile radar station on the northern tip of Oahu, Hawaii. I'm sure I butchered that name, by the way. But he is 20 years old. His shift ended at 7 o'clock. He stayed late because he wanted to keep practicing on the equipment. At 7:02, 51 minutes earlier, his radar screen had lit up with the largest single formation he had ever seen. 137 miles out, moving fast, moving south, moving directly towards Pearl Harbor. Lockhart did exactly what he was trained to do. He picked up the phone. He called the Aircraft Warning Services Information Center. He reported what he was seeing. The officer on duty, a lieutenant named Kermit Tyler, who had been in the job for 4 days, listened to the report and told Lockhart not to worry about it. Tyler assumed it was a flight of American B 17 bombers expected from the mainland. The radar signal was much larger than a normal flight of B 17s. But Tyler didn't know enough information about radar to know that. He had been in a job for 4 days. Lockhart hung up the phone, went back to watching his screen, watched the formation get closer and closer. At 7:53 a.m., the first Japanese bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. 20 minutes later, Lockhart had reported exactly what was coming.
And I want to pause there for a second because that story, one radar operator, one phone call, one 4-day lieutenant, is the entire Pearl Harbor story sort of in miniature.
It certainly was, and the attack on Pearl Harbor is almost universally remembered as a surprise, a bolt from the blue. Japan, hidden in the Pacific, launches a devastating attack that nobody saw coming. But that framing is almost entirely wrong.
Yeah, because the United States have been watching Japan's expansion across Asia for years, right? American codebreakers had partially broken Japanese diplomatic codes. There were 14 warnings delivered to American leadership in the weeks before the attack. Well, an American destroyer had sunk a Japanese midget submarine outside Pearl Harbor the morning of December 7th before the planes arrived. That same morning, they sunk a Japanese submarine. And Joseph Lockhart watched 183 aircraft on a radar screen for 51 minutes, reported it, and was told not to worry about it. Pearl Harbor wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of, I don't know, imagination. Maybe that's not the right word, but
I think that's actually the right word. And I think that distinction is everything. A failure of intelligence means you didn't have the information. They saw 183 aircrafts on a radar screen. A failure of imagination means you had the information. You just couldn't conceive of what it meant. To understand why, you have to understand what America believed about itself and about Japan in 1941. America is watching the war in Europe from a careful distance. The public doesn't want to get involved.
Mhm.
Japan has been expanding aggressively across Asia for a decade. China, Manchuria, French Indonesia, and America has responded with economic pressure, oil embargoes, trade restrictions. Japan imports 80% of its oil from the United States. The embargo is strangling the Japanese war machine. Negotiations are happening in DC. They're going absolutely nowhere. And the American military and political establishments hold a belief, deep unexamined, almost unconscious, that Japan will not attack the United States directly.
And I think it's worth being precise about why they believed that, right? Because it wasn't stupidity; it was a mode of failure that affects every sophisticated institution, right? Sort of mirror imaging, because American strategists looked at Japan and assumed Japan would make the decisions that America would make in the same situation. America, if it were going to attack a stronger naval power, would not launch a frontal assault on that power's main fleet base, right? It would probe, it would maneuver, it would avoid a direct confrontation that it would more than likely lose. And, we're again, this is looking in the mirror. Therefore, Japan will not do the same. Therefore, Japan will not attack Pearl Harbor. Except Japan's strategic culture was completely different, right? Not appreciating the differences between you and your enemy. And this is something that we could go on and on about that I believe is very pervasive today. But in this instance, Japan's naval tradition celebrated the decisive blow, right? The sudden strike that removes the enemy's capacity in a single action, right? Get the Achilles tendon immediately. And American analysts knew this intellectually, but they couldn't feel it. They couldn't model it from the inside. So they discounted.
And knowing something and understanding something are not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
You can know that your competitor operates differently. You can have it written in a report on your desk and still make decisions based on the assumption that they'll behave like you.
Right, because your model of their behavior is always filtered through your model of rational behavior. But ultimately, rational is in the eye of the beholder, right? And your model of rational behavior is shaped by your own culture, your own history, your own incentives. The map is not the territory, but the map is all you have to go on. You can't go on nothing. You can't make decisions in a vacuum, right? That map is all you have. And the danger lies in forgetting that those are two very different things.
Right. And the attack on Pearl Harbor was planned by one of the most remarkable military minds of the 20th century, Admiral Yamamoto, commander in chief of the Japanese combined fleet. And here is actually the extraordinary thing about Yamamoto, Mike. He was actually not a warmonger like a lot of Japanese generals at the time. He had actually spent years in America. He studied at Harvard. I also know somebody who studied and played baseball there. He
He's a Japanese
served.
warmonger, actually.
Talk about Michael's father who played baseball at Harvard, but you know, Yamamoto actually served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew America better than almost any other senior Japanese military officer. And because he knew America, he was deeply, fundamentally opposed to war with the United States. He told the Japanese government directly, he said, I can give you about 6 months of victories, maybe a year. But after that, if we haven't won decisively, America will outproduce us and we will lose. He was not guessing. He was describing industrial mathematics. Japan in 1941 produces 7 million tons of steel per year. Mike, can you guess what America does in that time?
I'm going to go with 80 million tons.
80 million tons is absolutely correct. Yamamoto knew this war was probably unwinnable, and he planned the attack on Pearl Harbor anyway.
So the man who designed the attack that started the Pacific War believed the war could not be won. Is that a fair characterization?
That's 100% fair characterization. He was caught between what he believed as a strategist and what he was ordered to execute as a military officer. Once the decision was made at the highest levels of Japanese government, once the die was cast, Yamamoto's job was to give Japan the best possible chance to win. And the best possible chance he calculated was a sudden, devastating strike that crippled the American Pacific Fleet before it could respond. It would buy Japan time, it would buy Japan room, and hope that time and room would somehow become something more.
Yeah, and I think that's a pattern that repeats across history, right? Brilliant people executing strategies they privately believe are doomed because the institution has committed, because the moment for dissent has passed. And it raises a question that honestly I don't really think has a clean answer, right? At what point does loyalty become complicity, right? And again, maybe that's not the right word, but when does executing a strategy you believe is wrong stop being professionalism and start being abdication of judgment, right? And I asked that question, not being, not being part of a Japanese military hierarchy in the 1940s, right? There is no such thing as I can appreciate as an outsider, right? That not following a direct order is not an
I don't
option,
know anything
right?
about that. For Japan, Yamamoto, he told the truth about the odds,
Hmm.
but he was overruled. And then after he was overruled, he designed the attack as brilliantly as he could. Whether that makes him admiral or tragic or both, I honestly generally do not know.
Hmm.
But what I do know is December 7th, 1941, Sunday morning, Pearl Harbor was one of the most beautiful natural harbors in the world. A deep bay on the southern coast of Oahu. I definitely butchered that name again.
I
It's
think
the
it's
same name.
Oahu.
Oahu,
Hmm.
wide enough to hold the entire Pacific Fleet. On this particular Sunday morning, the harbor holds 8 battleships: the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, the Tennessee, the Maryland, California, the Nevada, and the Pennsylvania, lined up in battleship row. Neat, organized, impressive, and almost completely undefended. The torpedo nets that should protect the ships have been removed to allow for boat traffic. The anti aircraft guns are not fully manned. Many officers are ashore for the weekend. Ammunition is locked in storage under peacetime protocols. At 7:45 a.m., Commander Japanese commander leading the first wave of Japanese aircraft looks down at Pearl Harbor from 10,000 feet. Everything is exactly where the intelligence said it would be. He picks up his radio and transmits the code word that tells the Japanese fleet that attack has achieved complete surprise. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger.
Yeah, and the attack comes in two waves. 183 aircraft in the first, 167 in the second, 45 minutes later. More than 2,400 Americans killed, almost 1,200 wounded, right? The USS Arizona explodes when a bomb penetrates to its forward magazine, which is about 1.5 million pounds of gunpowder that ignites in a single second. 1,200 men killed on one ship in 1 second. The ship sinks in 9 minutes. She's still there at the bottom of Pearl Harbor today. Her hull still leaks oil to this day. A slow, dark stain spreading on the water above where those nearly 1,200 men died. In 2 hours, the Japanese attack destroys or damages all 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 188 aircraft. 2 hours. What took years to build is gone.
I'm just going to pause for a moment. That's incredible that that amount of damage was done in 2 hours from an attack like that. The fortunate thing on the American side, I know there weren't too many fortunate things that day, but the aircraft carriers were actually not there. The USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga, the 3 most important ships in the American Pacific fleets, all of them at sea on December 7th, and all of them were safe.
Which is an accident that Yamamoto realized immediately, right? He had planned the attack around destroying those carriers. The battleships were sort of a secondary target. The carriers had left Pearl Harbor on routine missions in the days before the attack, but nobody on the Japanese side knew that. The weapon that would define naval warfare for the next 4 years was the one thing that attack missed.
And this is one of the great ironies of Pearl Harbor. The attack designed to cripple American naval power actually accelerated America's transition away from the doctrine that had many battleships the centerpiece of its strategy. Because the battleships were gone, America had to fight with carriers. And carriers, as the Battle of Coral Sea and Midway later in the war, would prove within 6 months were the future. Japan ironically destroyed the past and forced America to live in the future. Yamamoto reportedly understood this almost immediately. He is said to have told his staff after learning the carriers had escaped his famous line, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve."
You're damn right.
That quote may or may not have happened, but the sentiment was real. He knew what he had done and what it would eventually cost Japan.
So let's move on. Let's move on to the following day, December 8th. Franklin Roosevelt stands before a joint session of Congress. The speech is 6 minutes and 30 seconds long, the shortest war message, by the way, in American history. Roosevelt had written a much longer draft, but he had cut almost everything. He said yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The Senate votes 82-0 for war. The House votes 388-1. Would
One
love to know
person
who that
actually
one
said
was.
no. Holy
Right?
smokes. Actually, I do think it was a woman who she decided she didn't want to send anybody to war because she can go to war herself. So that was that one
Interesting.
dissenting vote. But I do want to talk about the speech for a moment because Roosevelt had every piece of context available to him: the failed diplomacy, the oil embargo, Japan's strategic calculations. He left almost all of that out.
Because context in that moment was the enemy of unity, right? The more context you provide, the more room that you create for debate. And Roosevelt needed a deeply divided nation with powerful isolationist factions, with millions who had watched Europe go to war twice in 30 years to become one thing. He needed that unity, right? We were, I mean, you think we're divided today, right? We were divided then. And if he had given those argument points, you could argue he wouldn't have gotten the solidarity that he needed among the American public, right? So he doesn't tell them what had happened, right? He told them what it meant, a date which will live in infamy. He named it before anyone else could, and then he stopped talking. It's one of the most precise pieces of crisis communication in history. Every sentence that isn't essential is a sentence that creates space for doubt.
Now, I want to bring this forward because I think Pearl Harbor is the most directly applicable story we've told on this show to modern organizations. Not D Day, not the Cuban Missile Crisis. I really do believe it's Pearl Harbor.
Why do you say that? Why Pearl Harbor specifically?
Because D Day is about execution under pressure. The Cuban Missile Crisis is about decision making under uncertainty. Both are, to be completely honest with you, extreme situations. Pearl Harbor is about that something happens in ordinary organizations in ordinary times and really every single day. The slow accumulation of unexamined assumptions, the
Mm-hmm.
gradual part of a system to filter out the signals that don't fit the story it already believes.
Confirmation
We,
bias.
right. And we've talked, Kodak had Pearl Harbor moments. Their own engineers showed them digital photography in 1975. The information is right there. The assumption: we are a film company. Film is our business. Digital is a curiosity, was so deep it didn't feel like an assumption. It felt like reality. So the signal was filed, noted, and essentially dismissed.
Right. I mean, think about BlackBerry, right? They had their it feels weird to say Pearl Harbor moments, right? That's but the general lessons, I guess, that you could distill without minimizing the tragedy of it all, right? Those moments were present, looking back at like BlackBerry, right? Their engineers warned leadership that touchscreen interfaces were coming and would dominate, right? The leadership's assumption was that users needed physical keyboards, right? That assumption had been true for a decade, so it felt like a fact. And the warning was dismissed, right? Resistance to new information that might change the model that has worked so well for you.
Blockbuster had Harbor moments. Obviously, it was not the same tragedy of what happened, like you said. Is a very big tragedy for me because I loved going to Blockbuster on Friday nights. But they were offered the chance to buy Netflix for $50 million in 2000. $50 million.
No,
The
that
assumption,
sucks.
I mean, it's billions and billions today. And the
Somewhere someone
assumption,
has to sit and think about that every day. Somewhere
I
right now
know,
there's a guy thinking about that.
I'd be up all night if that were me. But the assumption in that room was that people want to rent movies from stores. This that assumption had been built. That assumption had built $1 billion business. So
Mhm.
Netflix was laughed out of the meeting. The planes were already in the air. They just hadn't arrived yet.
So what do you actually do about this? Because it's easy to say, challenge your assumptions. But it's much harder to build an organization that actually does it and to consistently live that as leaders, right?
I mean, the intelligent community now requires something called alternative analysis, formal consideration of explanations other than dominant one. It
Hmm.
came directly out of Pearl Harbor. Red teaming, premortems, adversarial analysis,
Hmm.
naming your assumptions and then actively trying to break them. But here's the thing, process alone doesn't fix it. Really, the hardest part is culture.
Exactly.
Be- because if your organization signals even subtly that challenging the dominant view is dangerous, that raising alarms is career limiting, that the person who questions the strategy gets sidelines, then the radar operators will keep calling and the lieutenants will keep telling them, don't worry about the 163 planes that are in the air.
Right. Yeah, and I mean the question isn't really whether you have a process for hearing bad news. The question is whether people inside your organization actually believe that it's safe and not self-detrimental to deliver it, right?
And to be honest with you, those are very different things. And most organizations that think they've solved the first problem haven't touched the second.
Yep. So I mean 14 warnings. 14. And not one of them broke through because each one had arrived into a system that already knew the answer. 14. We're not talking about one. It's just wild to try and conceive of that.
And I want to end with Joseph Lockhart, the 20-year-old who watched the formation on his screen for 51 minutes, who did exactly what he was supposed to do, who called it in, who was told not to worry about it, and then watched the signal get closer and closer and couldn't do anything else. Lockhart was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his actions that he had done everything right.
Hmm.
The system had done everything wrong. He actually lived until 2014. He was 92 years old. Far more than 70 years, he carried the knowledge of what he saw on that screen, what he reported, what was ignored. I've tried to imagine what that feels like to
Hmm.
know that you told the truth clearly, correctly, in time, and to watch what happened anyway.
Well, and I made that stupid joke about the guy at Blockbuster who declined to buy Netflix for $50 million in 2000, right? I mean, but I mean, this is a whole different animal.
Yeah, and exactly. I don't think I could 70 years. I mean, that's a long time to keep something like this.
Hmm.
And but the failure at Pearl Harbor wasn't a failure of courage. It wasn't a failure of effort. It was a failure of the system's ability to receive a signal it hadn't already decided to hear. You can train for bravery. You can prepare for difficulty, but preparing to be wrong about the thing you're most certain of, that requires a kind of institutional humility that is genuinely rare and almost always built only after the cost of not having it has already been paid.
Yeah, and Pearl Harbor didn't happen because Americans were asleep, right? It didn't happen because we didn't have warnings. It happened because we were so certain of what we already knew. Certainty is the most dangerous feeling in any organization, right? Not because it's always wrong, but because when it's wrong, it makes sure that you are the last one to know you were wrong.
You're 100% right. And going back to Pearl Harbor and what happened on December 7th, 1941, the planes were on the radar. The warnings were on the desk. The submarine was in the harbor. Everything needed to prevent the catastrophe was already in the room.
It's not in the underlying assumptions, right?
Next week, the Apollo program, how America decided to go to the moon, not because it was easy, because it was hard. And what happens when an entire organization decides that the difficulty is the point. Well, that's it for the Empire Builders then and now. We'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, everybody.